The Source and Status of American Decline by Leah Nash. In this digital story, I will explore the point of origin of the period of decline that marked the late 20th century and early 21st century. Specifically, I would talk about the environmental and energy crises of the 1970s and 1980s and the rise of globalization and terrorism in the early 21st century. Concurrently, I will look at the details of each event to see how the finer parts affected the overall nature of America in that time period. In the post-war era, America boomed in so many ways. It boomed as a superpower, as shown in the graph of major economies from up to 2003, according to Angus Madison's estimates, and a superpower truly coming into the global position it now holds. There were baby boomers, economic boom, the boom of the suburbs and of the television, but this booming was not to last. It is my belief that the environmental and energy crises of the 1970s led to that period of decline, which stretched from the 70s on into the 21st century. The nature of politics and society on the national and global levels led to globalization and terrorism in the 21st century, products of that decline. The 1970s were a time of transition. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, the main presidents of that decade, would soon have their imprints overshadowed by the long-standing influence of Ronald Reagan. This doesn't mean that the decade was unimportant, though. In fact, in terms of the decline, the 1970s is the decade in which it all began, with oil being the catalyst. As the textbook states on page 661, the United States and its allies had long depended on Middle Eastern oil, and so long as the pipelines were full, low oil prices discouraged conservation or the use of alternative energy. This dependence on oil from abroad, coupled with unstable governments and uprisings, led to the energy crisis. Henry Kissinger's November 3, 1973 memo to various other governmental officials shows the U.S.'s feelings about oil in the Middle East. The back and forth between the men littered with talks of war all centered around the need for oil, for success via energy. Let's work out a plan for grabbing some Middle East oil if we want, is one of Kissinger's last statements in that meeting. As Professor Young says in her lecture, The Politics of Oil, U.S. consumption of oil intensified in significant ways in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as American demand finally reached and surpassed domestic oil supply, Middle Eastern oil was a necessity, one which the American government was anxious to tap into and control in some ways. The textbook also refers to the importance of that supply that became clear in the autumn of 73, when on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, troops from Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The 7 Arab members of OPEC supported Egypt and Syria by imposing a boycott on oil exports to countries seen as friendly to the Israelis. Lasting 6 months, the boycott staggered the Western nations and Japan. This is found on page 661. Looking over history as a whole, one can see just how connected everything is. As I said before, conservation and the use of alternative energy led to the construction of plants, which eventually led to the incident at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, as shown in the pictures on the left and top right here. The environmental issues of the 1970s were very complex, folding energy into their layers, and people jumped on it as the new Vietnam, the new thing to protest, as shown in the bottom right picture. The picture of the anti-nuke rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is characteristic of 1970s activism, with a strong focus amongst capitalists on expanding current energy technologies. The health of the environment, of wildlife, and of the atmosphere became a low priority. Mixed with the fact that the focus is on oil and subsequent hostility in the Middle East, it's no wonder people protested. The tug of war between these environmental and energy crises defined the political environment, and the conservatism of the 1980s was born out of this tension. The 1980s were the decade of the Republican, the rebirth and reaffirmation of conservatism as we know it today. From the beginning of Reagan's presidential career, when he announced his candidacy, his rhetoric was laced with what seems like a desire to not accept the decline as a decline, but simply a momentary setback. I cannot and will not stand by and see this great country destroy itself. I do not agree that our nation must resign itself to inevitable decline, yielding its proudest position to other hands. He said this during his candidacy announcement. At the same time, his speech also did not mesh with the decline and perhaps death of the working class. To me, our country is a living, breathing presence, unimpressed by what others say is impossible, was some of the rhetoric he used. But as Professor Young points out in the stagflation lecture, the 1970s was a decade in crisis in which America struggled with limits. All was not possible anymore, not in the way that it had once seemed. The 1970s was a decade in which Americans began noticing trends that had been development for many, if not most, of the post-war years, and that is the decline of the working class. This means that the working class, as an identifiable, celebrated, and significant of the American body politic, was reading its own obituary, Professor Young stated. But the attitude of the 70s, which was one of crisis and despair, was not that of the 80s. Perhaps tired with the darkness of the Vietnam age, conservatism and renewed hope began to take over, and Reagan at the fore. The Reagan era, or as some people say, Reaganomics, was a time that laid the groundwork for early 21st century. The politics of the Republicans affected how the energy and environmental crises progressed, as well as the state of the economy. On top of that, the globalization and terrorism can be seen as almost direct results of the Reagan era. You know, the most important goal that all of us share tonight is economic recovery. To get our economy moving again, it's imperative that we enact a federal budget that will bring down deficits and bring down interest rates, he said during his fiscal address. In other words, as we all know about conservatives, less taxes, less government spending, specifically on social programs. This was all in an effort to recover from a decline caused by the energy crisis. Our country was built on cheap energy. Today, energy is not cheap, and we face the prospect that some forms of energy may soon not be available at all. First, we must decide that less is not enough. Next, we must remove the government obstacles to energy production, and we must make use of these technological advances we still possess. Of course, waste must be eliminated and efficiency promoted, but not an energy policy. Right from this announcement, we can see what he and his fellow Republicans will spend the decade doing, fighting more for continued energy production of current sources and without government interference. More energy rather than environmental-minded path, and one that has led us to a place where oil is king, and other sources are still in the nascent stages. From the 1970s to the 21st century, America experienced a decline, specifically an economical one, but the country's actions in the faces of such anxiety led to a more threatening crisis in the 21st century: terrorism. Globalization is the hyper-connected across all nations nature of the economy. We are still at the peak of globalization thanks to technologies that have blossomed during our time. During Clinton's time in office, globalization, on the cusp of true potential, picked the economy back up. So it has been seen as a sign of strength in America, or decline. As Professor Young said, U.S. military strategies in the post-war era was largely focused on protecting access to foreign oil. This led us to be involved in certain overseas affairs. Looking at the graph of world oil supply disruptions from 1951 to 1992, one can see that all the major disruptions occurred in the Middle East. As well, the main crises in 1956, 1970, 1973, 1978, 1980, and 1990 all have ties to American involvement. Since the 40s, as Professor Young said, America was involved in Middle Eastern oil, often in meddlesome ways. One could say that these actions engendered the hatred that radicals in the Middle East have felt for the West. We gave them guns. In various ways, we helped them gain power. And then we turned on each other. I believe that globalization was created by Reagan's America, and terrorism was fostered by globalization. And that terrorism is just another threat amidst the long term decline that America is still experiencing. There is still an environmental crisis going on. Energy is still having troubles. The economy went through the recession, the worst issue since the Great Depression. The gap between the rich and the poor is vast, and the former deciding a lot of the politics. The economy is a go to point in looking at decline, which makes sense. But many other societal and political areas can be surveyed to reach that conclusion that America we live in is an America in decline, and has been so since the energy and environmental crises of the 1970s that first began shaking things up. This is my works cited, and thank you for watching.